Howdy everybody, Kamikaze Avalanche here, and I wanted to do another practical tutorial going over how I am using a modified version of a state machine to have the input that the player provides, and input I mean keyboard, controller, and such, have different results depending on the state of the game. So let me provide a quick demonstration for what I'm talking about right now. There's a lot going on in the background of the game. I've got a character right here, and my hero, he has a handful of cards and a set of gear. And in order to use a controller, I need to change how the game processes that input depending on where we are contextually. And I'm also using this to provide some shortcuts. So let me give a demonstration of what I'm talking about right here. And I put a text label up on the screen so that I'm giving a little demonstration of where we are in this state machine. So right now, we're at state 0, which is kind of the default. The default meaning nothing selected. The first thing that a character would do on their turn is they need to play a card. So without using the mouse, if I have a controller or a keyboard, how do I select those cards? Well, I set up the WASD keys to cycle through cards and cycle through gear. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use A and D So when I press A and D, the game recognizes that I'm in state 0 and then starts to use that, changes us into state 2, card selection, and cycles through those cards. Now I can press W and S and that doesn't do anything. But let's say I want to play one of these cards. So I hit the Enter key and that activates WHIP. So how do I cycle through the gear? Now you'll also notice that I moved to state 3, gear selection. So in this case, W and S allow me to cycle through the active gear. So in this case, I want to select the boots, and what that will do is that will give my hero 3 movement points. All right, so normally when I'm moving, I would click on the hero and then click on the destination. But this is about showing how I'm using the keyboard, and I want to use the same WASD keys to move the character. So here, I've set the Q, the letter Q, to enter a movement state. And when the hero is in a movement state, the WASD keys actually allow the player to move one space at a time. Now, if I don't want to use all of the movement, I can press Q again, and that jumps me out of the state. But let's say I'm going to go Q again and move there. I'm out of movement points, so it dumps me back to the base state. So again, I can use the A and D keys to cycle through these. Select this one, press S, that activates the sword. And now the WASD keys have changed again. And now the WASD keys actually move my cursor one tile at a time. Z key cancels, and that gets me out of it. Now I also want to have some keyboard shortcuts. So in this case, let me go back to the base state. let's say I want to play a card and I don't want to cycle through things. I know I just want to play the first card. So in this case, I can press the number 1, and that looks at and selects the first card. And let's say I know I want to play this card on the boots, which is the 6th gear. So I can actually just press the number 6, and that gives me the 3 movement points as well. So you see that, I'm using the same keys over and over again, but depending on the state that the player is in, depends on how those would be interacted. Again, let's try this again. I will press 1 to play Spirit, and then I will press 1 again to select the first gear, which is the sword. So now I'm cycling through those. You can see I've got this set up so that, different things will target the enemies. And you'll notice there as well, I have a Q and E to cycle enemies. So we'll play that, and that will kill that goblin. So let's take a look under the hood and see how this is working. So the first thing to point out is under the UI elements, I have that debug battle state. I only have that up there for understanding and debug purposes. I don't need it for the actual game, so I'm going to go back and hide that. But the way I'm handling this input is I created a node, and I'm calling it the battle state handler. One thing that's important here is I put this node in a group, battle state handler. And the reason why I have that group is so in other places in the code, I can reference this node to change the battle state from anywhere without having to worry about where the node is located in relative positions to the tree. So I can just do a get tree, get first node in group to reach out and touch this script that we're going to be looking at. Let me actually go ahead and show what that looks like. Battle state handler. If I do a search, right, you can see here I have get tree, get first node in group, and because there will only ever be one battle state handler, I can reach out and I can say change battle state. So that's why I have it in that group. It's just one way that I can reach out to it. So let's look at this node, and I've created subnodes for each of the states I potentially want the character to be in. Base state, that movement state, which uses the WASD to move the player one tile at a time. That card selection state when we're cycling through the cards. Gear selection state when we're cycling through the gear. A targeting state for when we want to cycle through enemies. An enemy turn one, which locks a lot of the user interface elements out. Menu state, so when they're looking at the menu, nothing else processes. And a special effects state, which is something that happens when I'm doing some special effects on some of the event cards. In here, you can see I've got some of them are nodes and some of them are node 2Ds. And the question of why are some of them nodes and some of them are node 2Ds, and the answer to that is the node 2Ds are required to do certain things on the map. I want it to use all nodes, but some of the functionality I want, interacting with the map, and some of the other things required a node 2D. So that might be a reason why you might go node 2D for one of those. So let's look at the anatomy of the scripts for each of my states. So they'll have different variables depending on what sorts of things that I want to be able to do. So in the movement state, I don't really need anything because I'm just going to be reaching out and touching the code for the player element itself. The card selection state, I need to know how many cards that the player has in their hand, and I need to know which current card is selected, right? So I have variables for each of those, and I'm doing a simple check if we're moving left, so we're pressing the A key, or we're moving left on the D-pad. If it'll check to make sure that I have some cards in hand, because if I don't have cards in hand, I just want it to do nothing. And then I will subtract one from the current card number. If the current card number is 0 or less, I want it to cycle to the maximum number of cards. So basically, if we're on the first card and we press left, it's going to cycle around to the front. And then I want the cursor to move to the card. Same thing for if I'm moving right. If I'm pressing the D key, I don't want to do anything if the hand's empty, right? If the hand's empty, we're going to bump you out to the center. Otherwise, we're going to increment the current card number. If that current card number is greater than the number of cards you actually have, I'm going to cycle it around to the first card, and then we're going to move the cursor. So each of these states is going to perform different function depending on what's going on. So the gear selection state, we're doing something very similar. So we're incrementing by 1 and we're cycling around. We're looking at the ones that we can interact with. Let's go back to this battle state handler script and dig into it a little bit more. So the whole purpose of this battle state handler is I am going to be taking the input that's coming into the game and sending it to a different script depending on which state we're in. Of course, we're going to track the state with a variable number here, and just for my understanding, I'm listing out what those states are based on the number. Over here in the input, I'm taking a look and listening to which key is pressed. No matter what key is pressed, I'm looking at the main battle state. I'm performing a match. So I'm only ever going to process input in this script based on what our battle state is at that given time. When an event is pressed and it's a certain type, and let me dig into what those are. So this says event.isActionPressed, and then I'm looking at activate movement mode. I'm doing a check to make sure that the player has movement points. So what is this activate movement mode? If I go into here and I click on project and I go into project settings, there's a tab here called input map. So let me type in activate movement speed, activate movement mode, ACTI. And that's going to be the joypad button, the top button. So since I have an Xbox controller, that means Y. Or it means when they press the Q button on the keyboard. So if someone is in the main battle state and they press Q or the Y button, it's going to change the battle state to 1. If I control click this, change the battle state, it has a 2 state, that's that input, right? We'll remember that I was changing it to 1 here. change battle state 1. This change battle state, if it tries to change it to the state that it already is, it's not going to do anything. So if for some reason we're already in the movement state and it tries to change it to the movement state, it's just going to ignore that and carry on. This is that update, that label I have for debug. I could comment this out, but since it's hidden, it's really kind of irrelevant. I can just leave this active. It's not an important one to comment out. It's not carrying a heavy lift here. And then I'm performing another match function. So if our current state is one of these, I want to go to that script and I want to process any actions that happen for exiting the state. So for this one, if they're in the movement state and they kick out of it for some reason, maybe it's because they go to a menu screen, I want it to go over here and I want to exit the movement state. So the spaces that they could move to get cleared up so that it's no longer visible on the map. That's what happens in this case. So I want to perform the exit state functions for the state I'm leaving. Then I'm setting the main battle state to the state we're transitioning to. And then I'm going to do a new match, and I want to perform the enter state functions. Again, for the movement state, we want to activate the player for movement. What does activate the player for movement do? Well, it looks at the number of movement points the player has and highlights each of the tiles that are that range or less. Right? So simple what this function is doing. It's checking to see that it's a different state. If it's a different state, it does the exit function for the state I'm leaving, changes the state number, the variable, and then it performs the enter state functions for the state we're moving into. Okay, so that's a simple example. Now let's look at if you're in that base state. If we press a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, right? If we want to select those cards. So we're in the main state and I press 1. I want to change the battle state to 2, which means I want to exit the base state. I want to enter the card selection state, and then I try and play that card by the number. So that's going to go into the card selection state, try and play. Look at if it's the number 1, if it's 2, if it's 3. It's only going to play if I actually have that card. And then if I have that card, it's going to select and activate that card's functionality. Again, here's where it's important when we're talking about the state machine. So if I have a card selected, that means that I'm already going to be in a different state. I'm going to be in the state after the card is played. It's going to try and move into the gear selection state. So again, when someone presses 6 at that point, it's going to match it. And then see that we're in state 3. And then it's going to do gear selection states, check gear, and then try and play that gear 1 through 6. Oh, hopefully that's pretty straightforward. In some cases, when I'm going to these states, right, all of these states that I have are going to have an enter state and an exit state. Even if I don't have anything in them right now, this exit state is empty because I don't really need to do anything when I'm exiting the card selection state. But it's important that the key ones, the enter state and the exit state, exist in all of these in case I want to make some changes for the future. I want them all to be very similar so I don't have to mess around with the code for exiting and entering states. The enemy turn, there is no enter state effect. So it's going to get caught by this wildcard character, meaning it didn't get picked up by a different match. I don't have an enemy state with actual code. The important thing about that enemy turn state is I just don't want these keystrokes to have any effect. Okay, so this was an example of my state machine that I'm using to have contextual processing of the input that the player provides, right? So depending on where we are in the game, it depends on how it handles the effect, how it handles that input, and gives us some shortcuts for really fast play. I honestly think that for this game, the keyboard and the mouse is fine for right now. Ideally, after I have this released on Steam, I probably want to consider a tablet version of the game, mainly because I consider this the type of the game that I probably want to play while, I'm killing time on the bus or something else where I just want it to be a touch iPad game. And in cases like that, I need to be able to have controller input, especially if people want to use it on the phone with the controller. So there's where we're at. All right. If you like the game, you thought it looked interesting for you, I'd appreciate if you follow the link in the description below. Check out the Steam page for it and perhaps wishlist it if it's up your alley. And I hope you picked something up from this tutorial. And have a good one, y'all. Later.